Dr. Evelyn Reed adjusted her archival glasses, her focus narrowing on the old photograph that had arrived at the National Archives that morning. Before we begin, please let me know in the comments where you are watching from and what time you are listening to this narration. We're interested in the places and times of day or night that these verified reports reach. The black and white image, dated 1934, captured what should have been a tender moment. A woman in a simple cotton dress embracing a young boy of perhaps 8 years old. They stood before a modest farmhouse, the flat horizon and weathered wooden fence suggesting a rural setting, perhaps somewhere in the vast, unforgiving plains of Nebraska. Just another Depression-era family photo. Evelyn murmured to herself, noting the woman's worn-out shoes and the boy's patched clothing. Details that told a familiar story of hard times and resilience. The photograph was part of a collection donated by the estate of a woman named Clara May Thornton, along with dozens of other family mementos from the early 20th century. But as Evelyn reached for her magnifying glass, intending only to examine the photograph's condition for archival purposes, something made her pause. The woman's face was a study in genuine maternal love. Her arms were wrapped protectively around the child, her expression soft and caring, exactly what you would expect from a mother holding her son. The boy, however, was a stark and unsettling contrast. Evelyn leaned closer, her breath catching in her throat, while the woman gazed down at the child with unmistakable affection. The boy's eyes seemed to stare straight ahead, past the camera, past the moment, with an intensity that felt deeply out of place for someone so young. His small hands, which should have been relaxed in his mother's embrace, were held rigid at his sides, clenched into tight, unnatural fists. "That's odd," she whispered, adjusting the desk lamp to cast a brighter light on the photograph. The more she studied the boy's face, the more a sense of profound unease washed over her. There was something in his expression, not the innocent wonder of childhood, but something else entirely. Something that seemed far too mature, too knowing, too calculated for an 8-year-old child. In her research log, Evelyn made a note. 1934, unusual family photograph. Recommend further investigation into the Thornton family history. She had no way of knowing that this single haunting image would unravel a mystery that had remained hidden for over 90 years. A mystery that would change everything she thought she knew about the power of a mother's love and the secrets that families keep buried in plain sight. 3 days later, Evelyn found herself driving through the winding, tree-lined roads of Bucks County, Pennsylvania, toward the sprawling Victorian house that had belonged to Clara May Thornton. The elderly woman had passed away at the age of 97, leaving behind a meticulously organized estate and a reputation in the small town of New Hope as someone who had lived a quiet but purposeful life. Clara's great niece, a woman named Julia Hayes, met Evelyn at the front door. Julia was in her 40s, with kind, intelligent eyes and graying brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She worked as a librarian in Philadelphia but had taken time off to handle her great-aunt's affairs. "I'm so glad someone from the National Archives is interested in Aunt Clara's collection," Julia said as she led Evelyn through rooms filled with carefully preserved antique furniture and countless photographs. She was passionate about family history, though she was always quite private about certain aspects of our family's past. The house felt like stepping back in time. The hardwood floors creaked under their feet as they walked past walls lined with family portraits spanning several generations. Evelyn noticed that many of the photographs were professionally mounted and labeled in Clara's neat, elegant handwriting. She never married or had children of her own, Julia explained, but she devoted her life to preserving our family's story. She used to say that photographs were windows into souls, that they revealed truths that people might prefer to keep hidden. They reached Clara's study, a cozy room with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and a large oak desk covered with magnifying glasses, photo albums, and stacks of research notes. Julia picked up a leather-bound journal from the desk. "This might interest you," she said, handing it to Evelyn. These are Aunt Clara's research notes about the 1934 photograph you mentioned on the phone. She spent years trying to understand that particular image. Evelyn opened the journal carefully. Clara's handwriting filled the pages with dates, observations, and a series of increasingly urgent questions. One entry immediately caught her eye. The boy in Mother's arms. Why do his eyes hold such darkness? What did he know that we never understood? The truth about Michael must be somewhere in these photographs. Michael, Evelyn said, looking up at Julia. Who was Michael? Julia's expression grew troubled. That's just it. We're not entirely sure. Julia poured 2 cups of coffee from an old percolator in Clara's kitchen, while Evelyn spread several photographs across the worn wooden table. The afternoon sun streamed through the lace curtains, casting intricate, shifting shadows across the images. What I'm about to tell you might sound strange, Julia began, settling into her chair. Growing up, I always heard whispered conversations among the older family members about a boy named Michael, who lived with my great-grandmother, Eleanor Thornton, in the early 1930s. But the stories never quite matched up. She pointed to the 1934 photograph that had started Evelyn's investigation. Some relatives insisted this was Eleanor's son, Michael, who died young of influenza. Others claimed he wasn't her biological son at all, but a child she was caring for temporarily. A few of the older family members even suggested that Michael never really existed, that the photograph showed a different child entirely. Evelyn studied the image again, her eyes drawn to the boy's peculiar, unsettling expression. What did Clara believe? That's what makes this so intriguing, Julia replied, pulling another photograph from a manila envelope. Aunt Clara found this last year while going through some old papers in the attic. The second photograph, also from 1934 but taken several months later based on the seasonal clothing, showed the same woman, Eleanor Thornton, standing alone in front of the farmhouse. She appeared tired, almost haunted, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Most notably, there was no sign of the boy. Look at the back, Julia urged. Evelyn carefully turned the photograph over. In faded ink, someone had written, "After Michael left us, may God forgive what we allowed to happen." Evelyn felt a chill run down her spine. Left us? But your family members said he died of influenza. Exactly, Julia said grimly. That's when Aunt Clara realized that our family had been keeping a dark secret for nearly a century. She became obsessed with finding out the truth about Michael, who he really was, where he came from, and most importantly, what really happened to him. Evelyn pulled out her notebook. Did Clara discover anything else? Julia hesitated for a moment before reaching for a third photograph. She found this hidden behind the frame of an old mirror in the attic. It's dated 2 weeks before the first photograph was taken. This image showed Eleanor Thornton with a completely different boy, one with lighter hair and a genuine, unforced smile. The family resemblance between Eleanor and this second child was unmistakable. This, Julia said quietly, was Eleanor's actual son, Robert. He died of pneumonia in early 1934, just days after this photograph was taken. Evelyn returned to Washington, D.C. with copies of all 3 photographs and Clara's research notes, her mind racing with questions. The next morning, she reached out to Dr. James Ingram, a colleague who specialized in photographic authentication and historical document analysis. I need you to examine these images very carefully, she told James as they met in his laboratory at Georgetown University. I want to know everything. The paper, the chemicals used in developing, any signs of tampering or manipulation. James was a meticulous researcher in his mid-50s who had helped solve several historical mysteries through his detailed analysis of photographs and documents. He placed the first photograph, the one of Eleanor with the dark-haired boy, under a high-powered digital microscope connected to a computer monitor. Interesting, he murmured after several minutes of examination. The photograph is definitely authentic, The paper and the chemical composition are consistent with 1934 photography techniques. But there's something unusual about the image quality. Evelyn leaned closer to look at the monitor. What do you mean? See this area around the boy's face? James pointed to the screen where the image was magnified several hundred times. The grain structure is slightly different. It's subtle, but it suggests that this portion of the photograph may have been subject to some kind of additional processing or exposure. He switched to the second photograph, the one of Eleanor standing alone. This image shows no such irregularities. It's a straightforward photograph taken with standard equipment of the era. But when James examined the third photograph, the one of Eleanor with her biological son, Robert, he made a discovery that changed everything. Evelyn, you need to see this, he said, his voice filled with a sudden excitement. He had overlaid the two images, the one with Robert and the one with the mysterious boy, Michael, on his computer screen, adjusting for the slight differences in positioning and lighting. Look at the background elements, he said. The fence posts, the shadows, the positioning of the farmhouse. Evelyn stared at the screen. The backgrounds were nearly identical, suggesting that the two photographs had been taken from almost exactly the same spot. But more importantly, James continued, look at this. He zoomed in on Eleanor's dress in both photographs. See this small tear in the fabric right near her left shoulder? It's visible in both images, and here this scuff mark on her shoe. He switched back and forth between the two images, the tear and the scuff mark appearing in the exact same place. These photographs were taken much closer together in time than the dates on them suggest, James said, his voice firm with conviction. Evelyn felt her heart begin to race. What are you saying? I'm saying that based on the physical evidence, Eleanor's clothing, the lighting conditions, even the way her hair is arranged, these two photographs were likely taken on the same day, possibly within hours of each other. The implications were staggering. One photograph showed Eleanor with her son Robert, who died in early 1934. The other showed her with a completely different boy, Michael. If the photos were taken on the same day, what did that mean? Had Eleanor posed with two different boys on the same day for some unknown reason? Or was something else going on, something far stranger and more complex? The mystery of the boy with the old eyes had just taken a very dark turn. Armed with this new, unsettling information, Evelyn decided to travel to Harmony, Nebraska, the small farming community where the Thornton family had lived in 1934. The town, now with a population of fewer than 2,000 people, still maintained its records from the Depression era in a modest town hall. Mary Jenkins, the town clerk, was a woman in her 70s who had lived in Harmony her entire life. Her grandfather had been the town's doctor during the 1930s, and she possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of the local families and their histories. Eleanor Thornton, Mary said thoughtfully as she pulled out several dusty, leather-bound record books. Oh, yes, I remember the stories about her. My grandfather delivered her son Robert in 1926. A sweet boy, but sickly from birth. He died of pneumonia in the winter of 1934. It broke poor Eleanor's heart. Evelyn showed Mary the photographs. The elderly woman studied them carefully, her expression growing increasingly puzzled. This is definitely Eleanor, she said, pointing to the woman in the images. And this boy, she indicated the photograph of Eleanor with Robert, looks just like the Thornton family. Robert had that same sandy hair and gentle expression as his father. But when Mary looked at the photograph of Eleanor with the dark-haired boy, the image that had started Evelyn's investigation, her face grew troubled. This child, I don't recognize him at all. And I knew every family in this area during the Depression. We all looked out for each other's children. She paused, studying the boy's face more intently. There's something about his eyes that's quite unsettling, almost like he's much older than he appears. Mary walked to a tall metal filing cabinet and retrieved a folder marked 1934 birth and death records. Robert Thornton died on February 15, 1934. She confirmed, running her finger down a handwritten list. But here's what's strange. There's no record of any other child living with Eleanor that year. No adoption papers, no temporary custody arrangements, nothing. She looked up at Evelyn, her brow furrowed with concern. According to our official records, after Robert died, Eleanor Thornton lived alone on that farm until she moved to Pennsylvania in late 1934. Yet you're showing me photographs that suggest otherwise. Evelyn felt a chill. Is there anyone else in town who might remember those days? Mary thought for a moment. Frank Gable. He's 94 now and lives at the assisted living facility. His family owned the farm right next to the Thorntons. If anyone would remember a strange boy living with Eleanor, it would be Frank. The Harmony Assisted Living Center was a modest, well-maintained facility on the outskirts of town. Frank Gable sat in his wheelchair by a large window overlooking a garden, his mind still sharp despite his advanced age. When Evelyn showed him the photographs, his reaction was immediate and visceral. "Dear God," he whispered, his hands trembling slightly as he held the image of Eleanor with the dark-haired boy. "I never thought I'd see that child's face again." Evelyn pulled up a chair beside him. "You remember this boy?" Frank nodded slowly. "Michael. That's what Eleanor called him, though I always suspected that wasn't his real name. He appeared at her farm shortly after young Robert died, maybe a week or two later. Eleanor was nearly mad with grief, and then suddenly, there was this boy. Where did he come from? That's just it. Nobody knew for certain. Eleanor claimed she was caring for him temporarily, that his family was going through hard times, but the boy—" Frank paused, his eyes distant with a memory he had clearly tried to forget. There was something deeply wrong with that child. Frank described how Michael rarely spoke, but when he did, his words seemed far too sophisticated for his apparent age. The boy would stare at people with an unnerving intensity that made adults uncomfortable, and he seemed to know things he shouldn't. Details about neighbors' private lives, information about events that had happened long before he supposedly arrived in Harmony. "The animals didn't like him," Frank continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. "My family's dog would whimper and hide whenever Michael was around. Even Eleanor's old milk cow would become agitated when he approached. Animals sense things, you know." Evelyn showed Frank the photograph of Eleanor standing alone. "What happened to Michael?" Frank's expression grew dark. "He disappeared one night in late summer 1934. Eleanor never spoke of it, but the next morning she was different. Relieved, but also haunted. She moved away within a few months and never returned to Harmony." "Did anyone report him missing?" "That's the strangest part," Frank said. "Nobody seemed to care that he was gone. It was as if the entire town had collectively decided to forget he had ever existed. Even Eleanor acted as though he had never been there at all." Frank leaned forward, his voice barely audible. "But I'll tell you something I've never told another living soul. 3 days after Michael disappeared, I was walking past Eleanor's farm and I saw her in the backyard digging. She was digging deep into the ground behind the barn, working through the night by the light of a single lantern." Evelyn contacted Julia Hayes immediately after her conversation with Frank. Together, they drove to Nebraska to locate the original Thornton farm. It had been abandoned since the 1950s, but still stood on what was now agricultural land owned by a local farming corporation. The current landowner, a practical man in his 60s named Robert Jensen, had grown up hearing stories about the cursed Thornton place. He readily gave them permission to explore the property, even providing them with the ground-penetrating radar equipment he used for checking irrigation lines. The farmhouse was in ruins, its roof collapsed, its wooden siding worn away by decades of harsh weather. But the stone foundation remained intact, and the old barn Frank had mentioned still stood. though its red paint had long since faded to a rusty brown. Evelyn and Julia spent the morning walking the property, trying to match the photographs with the current landscape. Despite the years of neglect, they were able to identify the exact spot where Eleanor had posed with both boys, a slight rise in the ground that provided a clear view of the house. Frank said she was digging behind the barn, Evelyn reminded Julia as they approached the weathered structure. The area was overgrown with tall grass and weeds, but the ground-penetrating radar would be able to detect any disturbances in the soil. Robert Jensen arrived with his equipment around noon. The radar unit looked like a large lawnmower with a display screen that showed underground features. As he slowly moved the device across the area behind the barn, Evelyn and Julia watched the screen intently. "There," Robert said, suddenly stopping the machine, "and something's definitely buried here. Looks like it's about 4 feet down, roughly rectangular in shape." Evelyn felt her heart begin to pound. "How big?" Robert studied the screen. "About the size of a large suitcase, or—" He paused, looking uncomfortable. "Well, it could be a small casket." Julia gripped Evelyn's arm. "You don't think—" "There's only one way to find out," Evelyn replied grimly. "We need to call the local sheriff's department. If there's any possibility that human remains are buried here, this needs to be handled properly." As they waited for the authorities to arrive, Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that they were about to uncover a truth that the Thornton family, and perhaps the entire town of Harmony, had been trying to forget for 90 years. The wind picked up across the abandoned farm, whistling through the broken windows of the old farmhouse and rustling the tall grass. In that mournful sound, Evelyn almost imagined she could hear the echo of a child's voice. Not the innocent laughter of a young boy, but something far older and more unsettling. Sheriff David Martinez arrived within the hour, accompanied by the county coroner and a forensic team from the state police. As a veteran law enforcement officer, Martinez had seen his share of unusual cases, but the possibility of investigating a 90-year-old potential crime scene was unprecedented in his experience. "We need to be extremely careful here," Dr. Linda Harris, the forensic anthropologist, explained as her team prepared their equipment. "If there are human remains, they'll be fragile after all this time. And if this is somehow connected to a crime, we need to preserve any evidence that might still exist." The excavation began slowly, the team removing layers of soil by hand once they reached the depth indicated by the radar. Evelyn and Julia watched from a distance, both nervous and fascinated by the methodical process. After 2 hours of careful digging, one of the forensic technicians called out, "I've got something." Dr. Harris knelt beside the excavation site and used a soft brush to carefully clear away the dirt from what appeared to be the corner of something wooden. As more soil was removed, the outline of a small handmade wooden box became visible, roughly the size of a child's coffin, but clearly constructed by amateur hands. "This wasn't made by a professional carpenter," Dr. Harris observed, noting the uneven joints and crude construction. "Someone built this quickly, probably under stressful circumstances." Sheriff Martinez documented everything with photographs as the box was carefully lifted from the ground. It was secured with a simple rusted latch, which was still intact after decades underground. "Before we open this," the sheriff announced, his voice grave, "I want everyone to understand the gravity of what we might find. If these are human remains, we are potentially looking at evidence of a crime that occurred in 1934. Everything must be handled according to proper forensic protocols." Dr. Harris carefully opened the latch. The lid creaked open, revealing the contents. Inside the box, wrapped in what had once been a white cloth but was now stained a dark, earthy brown, were the unmistakable remains of a small human skeleton. But as she gently moved the cloth aside, her expression changed from one of professional concentration to one of utter confusion. "This is unusual," she said, looking up at the gathered group. "These bones show evidence of abnormal development. The skull structure suggests that this individual was much older than their size would indicate. Possibly an adult with severe developmental abnormalities, or... She paused, studying the remains more carefully with a magnifying glass. Or what? Sheriff Martinez asked, his voice tense. I've never seen anything quite like this, Dr. Harris said, her voice filled with a mixture of scientific curiosity and awe. The bone density and the structure of the joints suggest someone who was chronologically much older than their physical size would indicate. And look at this. She pointed to the skull. Even from a distance, Evelyn and Julia could see that the dental structure was completely wrong for a child. The teeth were adult teeth, but in a skull that appeared to belong to someone much younger. It was a biological contradiction, a puzzle that defied easy explanation. While the forensic team in Nebraska continued their analysis of the mysterious remains, Evelyn received an urgent call from James Ingram back at Georgetown University. His own investigation into the photographs had yielded a breakthrough, a piece of historical context that would shed a stunning new light on their discovery. Evelyn, I've been researching historical medical conditions that might explain what you found, James said over the phone, his voice buzzing with the excitement of a researcher on the verge of a major discovery. Based on your description of the skeletal remains, I think we might be dealing with a case of progeria or a similar premature aging syndrome. Evelyn was unfamiliar with the condition. James explained that progeria was an extremely rare genetic disorder that caused rapid, accelerated aging in children, typically resulting in the physical appearance and health problems of an elderly person in a child's body. In 1934, medical understanding of such conditions was virtually non-existent. Children with progeria were often seen as medical curiosities, or worse, as something monstrous or supernatural. But here's what's really interesting, James continued. I found records of a medical case study from 1933 involving a child named Timothy Clark, who disappeared from a state-run facility in Iowa. The boy suffered from an advanced form of progeria and displayed behavioral abnormalities that made him difficult to manage in an institutional setting. Evelyn felt the pieces of the puzzle beginning to click into place. What kind of behavioral abnormalities? According to the medical records, Timothy appeared to possess the mental capacity and emotional complexity of an adult trapped in a child's rapidly deteriorating body. The combination of his frail, aged physical appearance and his advanced psychological development made him profoundly disturbing to those around him. He was described as manipulative, calculating, and capable of understanding and exploiting adult emotions in ways that seemed almost uncanny, even supernatural to people in the 1930s. The implications were staggering. Evelyn realized that what Eleanor Thornton had experienced wasn't a supernatural haunting at all, but a tragic and deeply human encounter with a child, suffering from an extremely rare medical condition that wouldn't be properly understood for decades. James, can you send me copies of those medical records? She asked, her voice filled with a new sense of urgency. I think Timothy Clark and the boy known as Michael might be the same person. After hanging up, Evelyn shared this new information with Julia. The revelation reframed everything they had discovered. Eleanor Thornton hadn't been dealing with something demonic. She had been dealing with a profoundly ill child whose condition made him appear otherworldly to the people of 1934. So Michael or Timothy died of his condition while he was staying with Eleanor? Julia asked, her voice filled with a mixture of sadness and relief. It seems likely, Evelyn replied. Eleanor was probably caring for him out of compassion, but when he died, she panicked. In 1934, people didn't understand progeria. If the authorities had found his body with its strange, aged appearance, they might have suspected her of harming him. Or worse, given the superstitions of the time, they might have thought something supernatural and evil had occurred. Evelyn paused, looking out at the excavation site where the forensic team was still working. Eleanor buried him in secret to protect herself, but also, I think, to give him the dignity of a proper burial that he probably never would have received otherwise. 3 weeks later, Evelyn stood in Clara May Thornton's study with Julia, having spent days piecing together the complete and extraordinary story from medical records, town documents, and Clara's own meticulous research notes. The mystery that had begun with a single unsettling photograph had revealed a deeply human story of compassion, tragedy, and the lengths one woman had gone to in order to protect both herself and a suffering child. The forensic analysis had confirmed their theory. The remains belonged to a child approximately 10 years old chronologically, but with the bone development and dental structure of someone much, much older. DNA testing, while limited given the age of the remains, had been compared with samples from the Clark family in Iowa, strongly suggesting that the boy known as Michael was indeed Timothy Clark. Aunt Clara suspected the truth, Julia said, her voice filled with admiration as she read from her great-aunt's final research notes. "Look at this entry from last year." She wrote, "Eleanor saved that poor boy from a lifetime of institutional horror, from a world that saw him as a monster. When his suffering finally ended, she gave him the burial he deserved, even at great personal risk to herself. She was not a haunted woman. She was a hero." Evelyn had arranged for Timothy Clark to be reinterred in the Harmony Cemetery, with a proper headstone that would finally give him a name and a place in history. The inscription, approved by both the Clark family descendants in Iowa and the Thornton family, reads simply, "Timothy Clark, 1924-1934. A child who knew too much suffering, finally at peace." The 1934 photograph now made perfect, heartbreaking sense. Eleanor's maternal love was genuine. She had opened her home and her heart to a desperately ill child who had nowhere else to go. Timothy's unsettling expression wasn't malevolent. It was a reflection of the profound confusion and pain of a child trapped in a rapidly aging body, a child who possessed an adult's awareness of his own mortality, but lacked the emotional tools to process it. Eleanor was a hero, Evelyn concluded, looking at the photograph one last time. In an era when people would have been terrified of Timothy's condition, when they would have seen him as a sideshow freak or a demon, she saw past his appearance to the suffering child underneath. She gave him comfort in his final months and dignity in his death. The story had revealed something beautiful about human compassion, but it had also highlighted how fear of the unknown could force good people into desperate, secret-keeping situations. Eleanor Thornton had carried the secret of her kindness for decades, unable to speak about the act of mercy that had defined her life, a silent burden that had been passed down through generations of her family. Evelyn carefully placed the photograph in an archival preservation sleeve. It would be donated to the National Archives collection. But now it would be displayed with the full story, not as a mystery, but as a testament to the power of human kindness in the face of the incomprehensible. The boy's face no longer seemed unsettling to Evelyn. Instead, she saw what Eleanor had seen: a child who needed love, care, and ultimately the dignity of being remembered not for his strange and tragic appearance, but for the quiet, extraordinary compassion he had inspired in others. In the end, the photograph had revealed its truth. Sometimes what feels wrong is simply something we don't yet understand.